In the war's last months, many men thought the nightmare was finally ending. Then Allied troops opened camp gates. Behind them stood places the Nazis had tried to keep unseen, filled with human suffering beyond anything those soldiers expected to witness. That sight stayed with them for the rest of their lives.
Evidence followed. On July 23, 1944, Soviet troops of the Second Belarusian Front reached Majdanek near Lublin. They left the first major Nazi camp found almost intact, with most evidence still there. Behind those preserved gates stood the usual prisoner route, a train without water, unloading, labor, or death. That path began in October 1941, soon after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The camp first held Soviet prisoners of war, and many died within weeks from hunger, cold, and disease. Then Majdanek expanded. It became both a concentration camp and a killing site. Trains came from Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands, and other occupied territories. People often reached the ramp after days without food or water. Polish political prisoners, resistance members, Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians accused of breaking Nazi rules entered the same camp. Guards killed some soon after arrival. They drove others into factories, workshops, and labor details until their bodies gave out. People died in gas chambers with Zyklon B, in shootings near large pits, through starvation rations, beatings, illness, and exhaustion. By the time Soviet troops arrived, about 78,000 people were dead at Majdanek. Jews made up about 59,000 of them. That total had weight on the ground. Ash lay in the fields, and named suitcases still stood in the warehouses nearby. The gas chambers were still there, with doors, vents, and traces of the substance still visible inside. The crematorium ovens had survived intact, and they showed recent use. Nearby, guards had dumped piles of ash straight onto open ground. Soviet troops also found execution pits with human remains, along with bones that fire had not fully consumed. The warehouses carried the same record in objects. Thousands of belongings remained inside: shoes, children's clothing, eyeglasses, cooking pots, prayer items, and ordinary household things. Some suitcases still carried names. Then came the papers. Camp records listed transport dates, prisoner numbers, work assignments, and deaths. The camp left evidence in rooms, in soil, and on the page.
After Majdanek stood open, panic reached the top of the SS. Heinrich Himmler controlled the SS and the camps. He ordered camp staffs near the Allied advance to evacuate prisoners or destroy the camps. The aim was simple: move prisoners deeper into Germany and hide the evidence. By late 1944 and into early 1945, that order had reached the roads. Guards drove prisoners out on foot with little food, no warm clothing, and no medical care. Some columns marched for days, others for weeks. When people collapsed from illness or exhaustion, guards often shot them where they fell. Thousands died along roadsides, in forests, and in villages across occupied Europe.
Before those columns moved deeper west, the SS had already opened another front. In occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were extermination camps built under Operation Reinhardt, the Nazi plan to murder Jews there. Not prison camps. Most people who arrived were killed within hours, before any long routine of detention could begin. For most arrivals, there was no camp life at all. By late 1943, the SS had shifted from murder to concealment at those sites. The procedure had an order. Gas chambers came down first. Then workers dug up bodies, burned them, and scattered or buried the ashes. After that, the ground itself was changed with fresh earth, planted trees, and small farms or plain buildings meant to make the land look ordinary. More than 1.7 million Jews were murdered across those three camps. So when later armies reached other camps in occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had already been dismantled. Much less remained. Majdanek exposed the truth before the SS could remove every sign of what had happened. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army reached Auschwitz in southern Poland. Auschwitz stood just outside Auschwitz. Auschwitz was no single camp. It was a camp complex. It was the largest and deadliest camp complex built by Nazi Germany. It held three main parts: Auschwitz I, the original camp; Auschwitz II Birkenau, the main killing center; and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp tied to German industry. Monowitz supplied forced labor there. More than 40 subcamps surrounded the area. The camp had operated since May 1940. First came Polish political prisoners, then the purpose changed completely. In 1942, Auschwitz became the center of the Nazi plan to murder Europe's Jews. Trains arrived daily from across the continent, bringing Jews from Hungary, Poland, France, Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands. At Birkenau, they were unloaded onto the ramp. Many were killed within hours. Another train soon followed it. The trains kept coming daily.
Those daily arrivals ended in evacuation. In January 1945, the SS forced about 60,000 prisoners on foot toward Germany and Austria. Soviet troops were closing in. On January 27th, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz and found about 7,000 prisoners still alive. Most were too sick or weak to march. Hundreds of children remained there, including twins and teenagers used in medical experiments. Many survivors could not understand that the guards were gone. Inside the camp, soldiers found corpses on wooden bunks and on the floor. In Birkenau, they found gas chambers and crematoria built for non-stop killing. The chambers had rooms for undressing, sealed rooms for poisoning, and furnaces that could burn bodies day and night. Near them, the warehouses showed the scale.
More than 370,000 men's suits sat in piles, and over 800,000 women's dresses filled long rows. Around 7 tons of human hair had been shaved off victims and stored for industrial use. There were mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, toothbrushes, cooking utensils, prayer items, and thousands of prosthetic limbs. Auschwitz had murdered more than 1,100,000 people. By February 1945, Soviet forces were closing in on Gross Rosen in Lower Silesia. The camp had opened in August 1940 as a subcamp of Sachsenhausen. It became independent in 1941. Gross Rosen was built around a massive granite quarry. The quarry was already waiting. Prisoners hauled granite blocks by hand. Most were starving. The work was meant to drain them fast. Many were beaten before they reached the wall. Some dropped the stones. Others fell from the quarry walls. Guards beat them again or shot them. Exhaustion, injury, and starvation killed the rest. More than 125,000 prisoners passed through Gross Rosen and its subcamps. At least 40,000 died there. By the time the Red Army reached Gross Rosen, the camp was almost empty. Mass graves sat near the campgrounds, and the barracks had been burned or destroyed to hide the evidence. The survivors left behind were too sick, weak, or injured to move, and many were near death. Medical care was almost non-existent. Disease spread fast, and Soviet medics fought to save whoever could still be helped. As the Red Army pushed west, Stutthof filled fast. New columns kept coming. Snow covered the ground. The camp sat near Danzig on the Baltic coast, and Danzig was then the Free City of Danzig. It had been running since September 1939, which made it one of the earliest Nazi camps. Over 110,000 prisoners passed through it, and around 65,000 died. In the final months, evacuees from other camps were dumped there. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding killed thousands more. Then, the guards drove prisoners toward the Baltic in freezing weather. Many were shot on the road. Others were forced onto the ice or into the water, and they drowned. On April 11, 1945, American troops from the 6th Armored Division reached Buchenwald near Weimar in central Germany. The camp sat on Ettersberg Hill. It overlooked Weimar. The camp had been running since July 1937, and it became one of the largest camps inside Germany. It was built for forced labor, punishment, and terror, not mass gassing. More than 280,000 prisoners passed through Buchenwald and its more than 130 subcamps, including Jews, political opponents, resistance members, prisoners of war, Roma, homosexuals, and people the Nazi state labeled criminals. At least 56,000 died. The SS were already fleeing. The camp was not empty. The prisoners moved first. Prisoners held part of the camp long enough for U.S. troops to enter, a place already turned inside out. An underground committee coordinated the final hours, and a partial uprising stripped the guards of their weapons before U.S. troops arrived. American soldiers entered Buchenwald. They found survivors wasted down to skin and bone. Some survivors could barely stand. They found bodies in barracks and open yards, and execution sites were still exposed. Some medical rooms still showed experiments on living prisoners without consent or anesthesia. The smell of death carried far beyond the gate. The gate did not hide it. American authorities forced Weimar civilians through the camp, past the barracks and the bodies. They passed the execution sites too. Many said they knew nothing. The evidence around them said otherwise. And Buchenwald showed these camps also stood inside Germany, within sight of German cities.
Buchenwald was only one stop. Another camp was waiting. On April 15, 1945, British troops from the 11th Armored Division entered Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. They had been warned about disease. The warning was not enough. Inside, they found the scene that would become one of the best-known images of the war in Europe. The camp had begun in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp. In 1943, it became a prisoner exchange camp for Jews held for German civilians abroad. That purpose vanished fast. By 1944, Bergen-Belsen had turned into a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the front lines. Trains came constantly, unloading sick, starving people who had already survived other camps and death marches. No gas chambers. Food rations dropped to almost nothing. Clean water disappeared. Sanitation broke down. People died slowly from hunger, disease, and neglect.
By the time British medical teams entered the barracks, around 60,000 prisoners were still alive inside the camp. Most were severely malnourished, and many were too weak to stand or speak. The camp had already collapsed before the British arrived, and survivors were living beside corpses. Another 13,000 bodies lay unburied across the grounds, in open fields, between barracks, and along the pathways. Typhus moved through the camp. Lice covered clothes and skin. Dysentery and tuberculosis were widespread. The water supply had failed, forcing prisoners to drink contaminated water. Toilets had stopped working.
British doctors and aid workers counted the living and the dead, then opened food stations at once. They moved survivors to nearby facilities, burned the barracks, and buried bodies with bulldozers. Many survivors were still too weak to stand. Even with that help, many were already beyond recovery. In total, more than 50,000 people died at Bergen-Belsen, and nearly 14,000 died after liberation. On April 29, 1945, American troops from the 45th Infantry Division reached Dachau, near Munich in southern Germany. Dachau stood near Munich. Opened in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power, it was the first Nazi concentration camp. It started with political opponents. Over 12 years, it spread into subcamps across southern Germany and Austria. Dachau was first. More than 200,000 prisoners passed through Dachau and its subcamps.
At the siding, the next shock was waiting. A freight train stood just outside the camp. Inside the cars lay around 2,000 bodies. They had been brought from Buchenwald, and many had been dead for days. Most died from starvation, disease, or exposure on the journey. The camp itself was worse. Barracks were packed past capacity. Prisoners were skeletal, many unable to move. Disease spread unchecked. Corpses lay in bunks, hallways, and courtyards, and some stayed where they fell because no one was left strong enough to carry them. The crematorium still stood nearby, intact. Execution areas were in plain view. Records showed punishment and killing across many years. The sight enraged many American soldiers. Some surrendered guards were shot on the spot, others were beaten. Later military investigations examined those actions. The gates only opened after force. Dachau was only one site. By spring 1945, the front kept moving and the search kept widening. Allied armies found dozens of camps and hundreds of smaller subcamps in cities, forests, factories, and mountains. Rails and paperwork linked them into one chain across the collapsing Reich. Many sites had taken prisoners evacuated from camps nearer the front. That made the last months worse. The trail led to Mittelbau-Dora near Nordhausen in central Germany. The camp wrapped itself around tunnels carved into a mountain. There, prisoners lived entirely below ground. They assembled V-2 rockets, a German ballistic missile used against London and Antwerp. The tunnels stayed dark, wet, and full of dust. Men slept beside the machines, ate little, and worked in the same air. Food ran short, disease spread fast, and beatings were routine. More than 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora. Over 20,000 died from starvation, exhaustion, executions, and untreated illness. Flossenburg raised the tally. It operated in Bavaria near the Czech border from 1938. The camp held political prisoners, resistance fighters, clergy, and people accused of opposing the Nazis. It forced prisoners into stone quarries and weapons factories. In the final year, executions rose fast. Over 30,000 died from hunger, forced labor, disease, and targeted killings.
When U.S. troops entered Mauthausen, the camp was already breaking down. The site sat in Austria. Near the Danube, the quarry lay below the camp. The Nazis marked it for incorrigible prisoners. Survival was not the plan. Below the camp, prisoners carried heavy granite blocks up 186 steep steps. The climb had a name. They called it the Stairway of Death. Men slipped on wet stone. Those behind them crushed the fallen. At least 90,000 died there. Hunger, overwork, exposure, and execution all cut them down. The same breakdown reached Neuengamme, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and countless subcamps across Germany and Austria. Food supplies ran out. Guards abandoned their posts at once. The guards left prisoners to die among the dead.
Once the camps went quiet, investigators moved in. Military teams came first. Medical experts followed into the camps. International organizations joined them soon after. Graves were opened. Records were collected. Investigators sorted papers by hand. Survivors were interviewed. The task was overwhelming. As the numbers were gathered, the scale of the crime became clear. Around 10 million people had been murdered in the Holocaust. Entire families vanished, and ancient communities were wiped out. In many towns, no one returned. Later researchers identified more than 44,000 camps, ghettos, forced labor sites, transit camps, and detention centers across Nazi-controlled Europe. They ranged from large killing centers to small work camps beside factories or farms.
In November 1945, Nuremberg put Nazi leaders on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the dark courtroom, film from liberated camps flickered on the screen. Judges, prosecutors, and defendants watched skeletal survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, and crematoria. Some defendants denied personal responsibility. Others blamed orders or claimed they did not know the full scale of the killings. Documents, photographs, and testimony broke those defenses. For the first time, that evidence did not stay with the survivors alone. It entered the court. The camp record became courtroom proof. That evidence became the accusation.